Hey, welcome. Welcome to my first YouTube video if you're watching on YouTube or if you're hearing on one of the podcast platforms. My name is Eli Hernandez. I'm 28 years old and I have a passion for Jesus. I have a passion for discipleship. I have a passion for teaching. And so today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to just be sharing my heart again as to why I'm doing this, what the Lord is telling me, and just things that you can expect later on in the future videos and future podcasts. So this is the time for you to get your tea, your coffee, your matcha, whatever it may be. I have my tea here and welcome to my living room, and we're just going to get started and talk about the word. So about 2 years ago, my husband and I moved to Kansas City, Missouri. 2 years ago, we used to live in California. We were there serving as intercessory missionaries in a local prayer room there and serving in our local church. And the Lord just transitioned us coming to Kansas City and being a part of IHOP KC, which is the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. And during our time here, the past couple months, just being in the prayer room, reading the Bible, there has been something that the Lord has just been constantly bringing to my mind, and I haven't been able to move past it. I don't know if that's happened to some of you guys, but there's just a certain passage in the Bible that it just grips your heart that you can't really move past it. And so that passage for me for the past couple of months has been the three parables that we find in Matthew 24, verse 45, all the way, and it goes into chapter 25, verse 30. And if you guys are familiar with these passages, Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the end times. He's talking about his return and the signs of the times, meaning the signs. What is it that we should be looking for when Jesus is coming back, and the tendencies that are going to be happening all around the earth before he returns. But then he jumps into these parables, and parables are like stories. Jesus talked a lot into it with parables because it was a way that he was just being able to be human, relating the Bible in human terms. And so there are stories. And so he gives these three parables. And these three parables are like three stories, basically telling us how people are going to respond before he comes back. It's telling us the tendencies that are going to be happening. But it's not just ordinary or it's not just random people. He's talking about the church. He's talking about believers. He's talking about how believers are going to react and respond before he comes back. And so it gives us a practical view of how we should and the tendencies of how we shouldn't respond before he comes back. And so it's very interesting. And the Lord has just been gripping my heart because there are two characteristics that he always brings up in these three parables. And he's basically looking and asking the question, who is going to be like the faithful and the wise servant? So there are these two characteristics of wisdom and faithfulness. The parable I'm going to be going over right now is going to be just the last one, which is the parable of the talents. And I think this is a parable we've heard many, many times. It's a well-known parable. We know that it's about a man who's beginning to entrust his three servants. He says these three servants, to one he gave five talents, to the other one he gave 2, and to another one he gave 1 talent. And the problem, or the theme here, it's not the problem, but the theme of this parable is about faithfulness. So Jesus starts emphasizing out of those two characteristics, this one is dealing with faithfulness. What does it mean to be faithful? And why is faithfulness important to the Lord? The problem or the crisis of this parable is with the servant that just received 1 talent, okay? And talent, the word talent in the Bible is referring to a term of money. It's not talent the way we think of it. It's not like my talent or my giftings or my abilities that God has given me, even though A lot of times we refer it just to that because it's something that the Lord has entrusted us with. It's not limited to just our talents and our giftings, though that is part of it. But what God has entrusted us with, I just want to challenge you even now, or encourage you even now. Think about what God has entrusted you with. Think about, if you're a mother or if you're a father, your children are people, heart, souls that the Lord has entrusted you with. The finances that we have, that's all that the Lord has entrusted us with. The ministry, the influence, whatever it may be, everything that didn't come from ourselves comes from the Lord. And all of that is what God has deposited into our lives. He has entrusted us with. And so it's not just limited to talents and abilities and giftings, though it does include that, but it's much more broader. The perspective is much more bigger. The Lord is entrusting us with precious things, precious people. Think about the friendship group, the worship team. If you're a pastor, if you're a small group leader, those are things God has entrusted you with. And the crisis that this servant is going through is because he's so preoccupied with how little God had entrusted him. He was thinking about, this is insignificant, what the Lord has entrusted me with. He was just so preoccupied with how little the Lord had given him and how little the external achievements he could accomplish with just that one talent. And I think about my own life. I think about our lives, how it is so easy to be consumed and preoccupied with how much it is that we have or how little it is that we have. We have fallen into this narrative of bigger, better, going after materialistic, going after influence, going after impact, and that being our main goal, that being our main priority, when our main goal should be Jesus. Our main goal, our greatest reward is Himself. And that's why when those things begin to shake, when the money begins to shake, when the idols of materialistic gain, when we don't have the influence we were looking for, when we don't have the impact that we were looking for, it really becomes a struggle for us to continue to remain faithful. The only way we can remain faithful in the small and even in the big is when Jesus is our main priority, when Jesus is the main goal. It's not so much of what do I have in my hands? It's much more about who am I looking towards? Who is the one that brings me my identity? It's not the impact. It's not the influence. And I know that even if I have that, it's because He has entrusted me with that. That's not even mine. It's His at the end of the day. And so good news, God doesn't measure our lives the way we do. The Lord doesn't measure success and impact and influence the way we do. Lord here is emphasizing, you know what actually moves me? It's faithfulness. You know what actually moves my heart and that I see is great? It's faithfulness. Even if it's little, even when you have many things, when the Lord has entrusted you with a lot, what moves my heart is faithfulness. And that's what He is saying in this parable. What moves me isn't how much you have or how little you have. It's about how your heart responds in the little or even in the big. That's the theme. That's the conversation. That's what He's focusing on. And don't get me wrong. Don't misunderstand me. I think we were all created with a desire to leave an impact and to leave a legacy. That is one of my greatest desires, is to leave an inheritance for my children, a spiritual inheritance for my generation. I just want to even be able to challenge our perspective of impact. What if the greatest inheritance, what if the greatest legacy that you and I can have is to disciple our children to love the Lord? What if the greatest impact we can have is being faithful in that prayer meeting that you're in charge of, that you're leading in your friendship group or you're leading in your local church? What if the greatest legacy you can have is to continue to evangelize to those two people that are in your friendship group or that are going to your classroom? What if that is the greatest impact? What if the greatest impact could be being a good steward of your finances? I just want to challenge the way that we're thinking about impact, the way we're thinking about legacy, because the Lord doesn't think about impact the way we do. What the Lord is so moved by is when we're being faithful and we're being perseverant, no matter if it's great, if it's big, or if it's small. If I'm preaching just to 5 people, I'm going to be faithful and zealous for that, the same way I would be if I'm preaching in a stadium of thousands of people, because it's not about who or how many I'm doing it to or how little I am doing it to, but it's about me being faithful and my heart response. And so I want to challenge you to rethink what it is that you think about impact and legacy, what it means to really be faithful in the small. This is the way that we can remain faithful even when it's hard, even when times get hard, even in the times that we're living in, that it's very hard. I'm not saying that living a life as a believer is easy. Jesus never promised that. And times will get harder according to what the Bible says. But the only way that we can remain faithful and stable is when Jesus is our greatest gain, not money, not influence, not comfort, Jesus. And I was struggling with this myself. I had started to get into this conversation in my heart where I was so preoccupied with how little it is that I had. I was like, Lord, I have a little bit of responsibility. What you're asking me doesn't look that great. And I was just despising the one that he had given me, the one thing that he had entrusted me with, because it just didn't look as great or as grand. And in my heart, I fell into a lot of grumbling, complaining to the Lord, a lot into comparing myself. Well, how come they have more? How come I have this little bit? Maybe you don't like me. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. And this is exactly the response of the servant with 1 talent. It says that he didn't do anything with it but dug his talent. So he neglected it. He didn't really cherish it. He just went in and dug a hole and buried it down in the ground, to the point where he was having these kind of conversations that it made him bitter and resentful against God. And I started finding myself into that conversation. And I see that to be a tendency when we don't have the right perspective. The first thing we do is we start letting this grumbling and complaining happen in our hearts, this conversation, this wrestle in our hearts, but we turn it against God and against his nature. And we start to say, Lord, you're not good. Why are you doing this to me? And it's all because we have the focus on the wrong place. His focus was on how much or how little it was that he had, rather than him himself. And I was really falling into that. And the Lord really touched me as I was reading this parable. And I thank him for touching me, because it really made me realize that I was not focusing on the right thing, which is him. I was so preoccupied with the influence and the impact and how many people am I touching? How many people am I impacting? And the Lord told me that's not what's important. That's not the conversation. That's not what you were made for. He was telling me, he's like, you really are effective in the small. Be faithful in the small. And sorry if you're seeing me a little bit emotional, but it's just something the Lord has really been hitting my heart with and confronting my heart with. and without knowing it, how many idols we have constructed for ourselves, and how much we need to repent of that. How absorbed and influenced we have been by the narrative of this world, and how the Lord wants to take us out of that, because he wants to give us freedom. He wants to give us freedom to actually know that we don't have to be striving for having a stadium full of people. We don't have to be striving for, if you're a songwriter, your music to be heard by millions of people. That's probably only going to be 2% of people or 3% of the entire population of the world that can have that. But he's even saying, like, I validate you and your life, even if you're just a stay-at-home mom. Your life is so important to me, and what you're doing is so important to me, even if you're just being obedient and faithful, even if it's just evangelizing to your classmates at school because the Lord has put that in your heart, even if it's being faithful to that friendship group, or being faithful to that youth group, being faithful in that worship team, even when it's hard. The Lord says, I see that, and that moves my heart. And I think that's just so freeing and so healing for our lives, and it's just so freeing for my heart. And I was just realizing how distracted, how I was caught up in that false narrative, that I was even neglecting the very things that the Lord was entrusting me with. And I was just neglecting it because I just despised it. In other words, I was just like, I didn't think this is what you're telling me to do. I wanted it to be something else. I wanted it to be something better. And for me, those were two things. For me personally, first of all, was to be faithful in my home. And it sounds so simple, but really, I think at times I was struggling with being faithful with simple things of my home, because I was always thinking how I can use my time better or more effective. And I think for all of us, it's very easy to neglect the things of the home. It's very easy to neglect washing dishes or neglect doing laundry, or, kind of despise it, making it more minimal, when the Lord was really telling me that's ministry. That's ministering to my heart, because you're serving your home. So that was one. And the second was about what I'm doing right now, which is teaching, and teaching through these kinds of platforms, and just to be a messenger, and to do it both in English and in Spanish. So as you can see, I'm doing it in both languages. So it's the majority of my content is going to be bilingual for this reason. And again, it seems insignificant and doesn't seem so grand, but for some reason the Lord has just been putting that in my heart. And English is my native language, Spanish is my second language, but I was constantly trying to avoid doing that. First of all, I was constantly trying to avoid teaching on these kinds of platforms, but I was also trying to avoid teaching in Spanish, teaching in a different language. And I was just procrastinating it, trying to put excuses, putting my insecurities in it as an excuse before the Lord. But the Lord just kept putting that in my heart. And so those were the two things that the Lord was asking me to be faithful in. And I'm really trying to practice that. And so I just want to encourage you today, where you are at, whatever season of life that you find yourself in, that the main priority, the main goal you can have in your heart is to be faithful unto the Lord, in the small or in the big. Don't make the quantity the biggest narrative of your heart or of your mind. Don't fall into comparing yourself with other people. Don't fall into grumbling, but have a heart that's free from bitterness. Have a heart that's free from comparison, that you can freely be faithful. Because what our generation needs now more than ever, our future generations need now more than ever, are people who are able to remain in faithfulness. People who have paid the price of being faithful in the small, and people who can remain faithful even in the midst of trouble, in the midst of chaos, in the midst of so many things happening all around us externally. The Lord is looking for that, and the Lord is saying, that's what really matters to me, and that's what I'm really looking for. That is what actually moves my heart. It's faithfulness. Faithfulness in the small, in the big, in every season of life, in good times, in bad times, in times of prosperity and in times of lack. We want to remain faithful, a heart that is stable before the Lord, and a heart that's fully content in all seasons. And so I just want to encourage you today. I really want to just charge you with this. Be faithful. That our greatest desire would be that Jesus, when we stand before him, that he can say, well done, good and faithful servant. And that he can see my life, that I was faithful, even when it seemed small, even when it seemed insignificant to the world. My heart remained faithful. My heart remained faithful to him, and my heart remained faithful with what he gave me. I just want to encourage you to take this into prayer, to study these parables in your own time and talk to the Lord about these things. Ask him to reveal your heart, to remind you of what faithfulness really looks like, what really moves his heart, to take it to prayer, to just study this in your own time. And if this really has blessed you, to share this video, to share this podcast with other people that you know that need to hear this word, need to be encouraged by this truth of the word. I just want to thank you again for being here. So excited for what's going to come, and I'll see you next time.